talk a little bit about what it means to be in quasi-recovery, quasi, however you say it. And that just means you're kind of like, you've got one foot in recovery and then one foot in your eating disorder or addiction or whatever other vice it is. You haven't taken the full plunge into recovery, but you're also taking some small steps. There are a lot of mixed views on if quasi-recovery is really recovery. Being in recovery from any sort of addiction really is a full-time job. It requires so much mental and emotional energy to rewire your brain. So it makes sense that it's difficult to take the full plunge. It's so much easier to just do a little bit at a time. And doing a little bit should be validated because you're still taking steps in the right direction, even though they are small. And any effort should be validated. But I guess the question that I'm here to talk about is, are you holding yourself back by being in quasi-recovery and by not going all in with it? If I'm honest, there's a lot I let sneak by. I have yet to go all in with my recovery unless I was forced to in a treatment environment. But what does it really look like to be in quasi-recovery? Maybe you're not overtly indulging in your eating disorder or other mental illness or addiction, but it still has control of you and control of almost every situation. Maybe in the circumstance of an eating disorder, maybe you are technically eating more, but are still following certain food rules or not consuming certain food groups. Maybe you no longer track calories, but you still make food decisions based on numbers that are in your head all the time. As I've spoken about before, a lot of these things are automatic and compulsive, and they develop that way over time. So it makes sense that they don't go away easily, even if you claim that you're in recovery and even if you are actually putting effort into your recovery. Does being in quasi-recovery actually help, or does it extend the life of your eating disorder? This is a question I still struggle to answer, because on one hand, developing coping skills over time can be really effective. Each time you use a coping skill or face a challenge, no matter how small, it is a victory and makes conquering that same thing again even easier every time. Challenging yourself a little bit every day proves to yourself that it is possible to not engage with your disordered urges or addictive urges and behaviors. And the world doesn't go up in flames. The world doesn't end, and you can survive that. This is the equivalent of sort of chipping away at it slowly. The idea being that eventually it will just crumble entirely. But the question still remains, will it ever get to that point? Will it ever actually crumble? Will it ever be enough? And are you doing yourself a disservice by not nipping it in the bud as soon as possible? That's definitely the scarier option. I've also mentioned before how smart and adaptive eating disorders specifically are. So one can argue that by going the sort of quasi-recovery route, you're giving it a chance to adapt and continue to thrive instead of shining a light on it in its entirety. The eating disorder will learn what it can and can't get away with. An example from my experience in quasi-recovery is that when I committed to eating more, but didn't focus on the exercise compulsion part of things, my eating disorder learned that it can get away with leaning more into exercise urges and doing more of it in order to compensate for my increased food intake, which sort of defeats the purpose. I've talked a little bit before about my relationship with exercise and movement and how that's been the hardest thing for me to let go of, and I haven't really been able to go cold turkey with it. Another example is that when I was put on a meal plan, my eating disorder responded by coming up with new food rules, including like what time I was allowed to eat and what food groups I wasn't allowed to have. There were food rules there to begin with, but it started coming up with new ones that were even more controlling in a lot of ways. The list really goes on, but the point is that it's kind of like whack-a-mole, and if you don't whack them all at once, you run the risk of another new thing popping up. I go back and forth on whether or not I think quasi-recovery is truly recovery. The intention is there, and that deserves to be acknowledged and congratulated. Personally, I've been able to overcome a lot of hurdles and face a lot of challenges being in quasi-recovery. And each time I do something small, it proves to me that there is life worth living outside of my eating disorder. But part of me definitely wonders if I could have been out of this tunnel sooner had I plunged in and plugged up all the holes at once and really not acted on one single disordered thought or urge. There's a reason why for addicts, the protocol is complete sobriety. Any one sip of alcohol or any one hit of a drug can be really detrimental. Maybe there is an argument that complete sobriety should apply to eating disorder recovery as well. And maybe that's the only way to recover, is by being sober from your eating disorder completely. Anyway, I'm interested to hear others' thoughts on this and what you think of quasi-recovery versus going all in. In the meantime, I'm still gonna keep trying my best and chipping away at it however I can.